Not long after the final shot was heard, echoing through the Preston Valley, and the final breath of the dying was taken, the work of remembering began. When the U.S. Army, under the command of Colonel Patrick Edward Connor, attacked a sleeping Indian village in the early morning hours of the day, they controlled for a time what was to be remembered, but not anymore. Have you ever had a memory sneak out of your eye, roll down your cheek? I have that all the time when I think about the massacre at Bear River. You see, for thousands of years, our tribal elders would sit down with the young children and tell them stories. The stories are always the same. There was never a word out of place. It had to be that way. It had to be accurate. Our children needed to hear the stories as their elders had heard the stories. Because in our culture, as you know, nothing is ever written down. So I went through the same process with my grandmother. Her name was May Timbinboo Perry. She was the most beautiful woman that I'd ever met. She had black hair with deep creases that told of the life of a loving, caring tribal elder who loved her people. She would sit for hours and tell me stories about how the coyote stole fire, or how the sun got its name. And then with reverence in her tone and sometimes a tear in her eye, she would relate the story of the massacre at Boa Ogai. There's an old Indian saying that says, when an old Indian dies, a library burns. And that was never as true as it was about my grandmother. Because of her, as I grew older and I attended school, I developed a great love for history. And then one day, sitting in class, I suddenly realized something. None of the stories that my grandmother told me are in our history books. But how could this be? I had always believed that historical events were an absolute, that events that transpired historically over time had one conclusion. But as I've gotten older, I've come to realize that history is about perspective. Whose perspective? And then one day I read a quote that was attributed to Winston Churchill. And he made it clear when he said, history is only written by the victors. Well, that perfectly explains why Native American histories aren't in our history books today. Chief Sagwitch and his people lived like their forefathers had lived for thousands of years. They were hunters and gatherers. They traveled with the changing seasons. He was born in 1822 near Bear River City. He was born at the beginning of the fur trading era, which means he never really knew a time in his life without the presence of the white man. The Shoshone referred to themselves as Sosogoi, which means people who travel on foot. We looked upon the earth as not just a place to live, but something so sacred and special that we call her mother. She is always the provider of our livelihoods. You see, to my native people, the mountains and the streams and the plains stand forever, and the seasons walk around annually. We traveled to different areas when the game was plentiful and the seeds and berries were abundant. If you can imagine, it was a hard way of life. We were probably never more than a few days away from starvation, but it was a happy life. Every member of the tribe played an important role in its survival. This family relationship was sacred, as it should be to you. In the summer of 1847, however, something significant happened. Sagwitch received word from other groups of tribes that there was a group of white settlers in Wyoming making their way towards the Salt Lake Valley. And on July 31st, Sagwitch had the opportunity to meet Brigham Young and the first group of pioneers? Well, within months, disputes arose between the Mormon pioneers and the Shoshone over the land and the stewardship over their trust over a sacred piece of ground. Sagwich's life was now going to be complicated. In 1856, the church sent Peter Mon and others north to find other lands to occupy, and they landed in Cache Valley. In those early days, the saints referred to Sagwich and my band as the friendly ones. As more and more saints arrived to the Cache Valley, and resources began to become scarce, those same early pioneers began to describe us as thieves and beggars, which was probably true from their perspective. With this development and the use of the California and Oregon trails that also cut through the heart of Shoshone land, I think our people had three options: beg for food, starve, or steal. And I'm sure they did all three. In early January of 1863, Mormon settlers from Cache Valley and those using the Oregon and California trails began writing letters to Salt Lake, making requests to put an end to the Indian depredations. Colonel Patrick Edward Connor from Camp Douglas, Utah in Salt Lake was now mustered into service. They were led by a Mormon scout named Porter Rockwell, who led Colonel Connor and his men just north of Logan, Utah, near Preston, Idaho, where Battle Creek meets Oogai, or what you know as the Bear River. On the night of January 27th, an old spiritual medicine man by the name of Tyndall had a dream, because that's how the Creator speaks to my people. In his dream, he saw his people being killed by pony soldiers. He woke everyone up, told everyone of his dream, and urged them to move with him and his family that night. There were many families that believed the dream of Tyndall, and they moved and their lives were spared. Sagwich, being an early riser, got up on the morning of January 29th as usual. He surveyed the camp, and he noticed to the southeast there appeared to be a steaming mist on the top of the bluff. And then the mist creeped lower along the bluff, and he suddenly realized something, that the soldiers from Camp Douglas had arrived. The chief wasn't surprised. He started calling to his sleeping village. They quickly gathered their bows and their arrows and tomahawks, and I'm sure some of the men had rifles, but very few bullets. Some of the Indians were so excited they gathered what was ever in sight to use to fight with. My grandmother told me some of the women picked up their woven willow winnowing pans to use them for shields. Colonel Connor and his men began to ford the river, and they began to fire upon the Shoshones. But what was an arrow compared to the sidearms and rifles of the soldiers? The Indians now were being slaughtered like rabbits. Indian men, women, and children and babies were being slaughtered left and right. No butcher could have done any better. The massacre started early in the morning, according to my people, and lasted for hours. The Bear River, which was slightly frozen sometime earlier, was now starting to flow. And some of my people were now jumping into this river to try to escape by swimming across. The Indians that were still alive started calling to their chief to escape with them. Sagwich did escape with a bullet wound in the hand after having 2 horses shot out from under him. The cruelest killing, though, was that of Chief Bear Hunter. They knew that he was a leader. They had shot him, they'd whipped him, they'd stabbed him, they kicked him. And through all of this, that old chief would not utter a word or cry out for mercy in any way, because he felt like it was a sign of cowardice. Because he would not die or cry out for mercy, the soldiers became angry and stepped to a burning campfire. One of the men heated his bayonet in the campfire until it was glowing red. He then ran that hot piece of metal through that chief's head from ear to ear. Bear Hunter went to his grave a man of honor. The surviving Indians couldn't believe what had just taken place. They were remembering that just days before, the camp had been a happy place. At this time, Savage realized that he was now living in two different worlds. One group was greedy and wanted everything. The other group only wanted to live and travel as they'd always lived for thousands of years. One group made their wishes and dreams come true by making themselves a conqueror at the expense of a defenseless people who only wanted to be left alone. Just north of Preston, Idaho today, you'll find an old monument just off of Highway 91 that's close to the massacre site. It was meant to tell the story of what happened on that fateful day. What a monument really accomplishes, though, is that it gives people a reason to forget. A monument strips us of our obligation to find out for ourselves what actually took place. And a monument always tells us how it wants the past to be remembered. You see, humans have great memories for what they want to remember. In commemorating the battle, you forget the uglier parts of history, and you begin to focus on the heroism of the soldiers and the saints. That's the kind of Daughters of Utah Pioneers monument that exists there today. And that narrative now becomes the story. It's not a story about my people. It becomes a story about the brave soldiers and the pioneer women who took care of them. In constructing the monument, you firm up memory and you create history. The events that took place on that cold January morning have long been forgotten by most. Maybe guilt or remorse have silenced all those who one day may have wanted to know the truth. It's my hope that a new generation will have a desire to listen and to learn, not because we're looking to have things made right. We're not. But I believe that those who gave their life that day and sacrificed so much have a God-given right to be heard. Their voices speak to me from the dust. My grandmother would tell me, if you're there at just the right time in the evening, you can sit, you can hear the cries of the little ones crying for their mothers. Your senses tell you that you're among the spirits of more than 400 children of that great Spirit who created us all. You don't have to see things as they were to know that a terrible injustice had taken place. You can feel it. The massacre of Boa Ogai has taught me many lessons over the years, and I want to share them with you. It has taught me that bad things happen to people, you and me. But how we respond to those events will determine our character, and it'll make us who we are. It has taught me to offer unconditional forgiveness, but it doesn't mean you need to forget. It has taught me that everyone has a story worthy of being told. What is your story? Because your story is equally as important as mine. And it's taught me that as we preserve history, it's important that all of our views are represented and respected. Ultimately, The story of Bear River is our story. And in some ways, I hope you respect the story that we want to have told, as well as recognize your role within that story. History doesn't always affirm us. Sometimes history challenges us to think about an uglier past that we'd rather not have. But that's really the power and the benefit of history. It connects us to the past. It connects us to our humanity and our inhumanity. And it offers us a way to move forward, especially in a circumstance like this with my Shoshone people. Moving forward in a way that connects us not in the prettiest of ways, but to move forward to a new relationship that is a 21st century relationship based on respect. Respect for the truth and what happened in that past moment. That is where you get the possibility for reconciliation. Thank you.